It's round 6 of the US Championships, and the man in tremendous shape in this event is Fabiano Caruana. He is winning game after game, playing very ambitious, cool chess, but he had to deal with a small setback in the previous round. As you could have seen in my last video, he won his game against Christopher Yu, a young American grandmaster, but Yu left the playing venue totally frustrated, and on his way he even punched a female employee in her back. And well, that's enough reason for the tournament organization to expel Christopher Yu from the remaining games in this event, which means that Fabiano's victory, it doesn't count. Well, in fact, the results of Christopher Yu in this event, they have been taken out from the standings. The game Fabi won against Christopher Yu, it should obviously count for rating still. So in a way, Fabi should still be happy having collected a few more rating points in his hunt towards Magnus Carlsen. I mean, maybe one day he can still leapfrog him in the World Live rankings, but still, that's a long way to go. What means is that Fabi's win doesn't count for the tournament standings. And how do you deal with that? You really want to win the tournament. It's a tough event. It's not easy to win games, even against players 100, 200 points lower rated than you. So that is quite frustrating for Fabiano Caruana as well. Now in round 6, he's actually playing with the white pieces against Grigoriy Oparin, who is actually very well known to him as they are working together. Oparin is one of Fabiano's trainers, sparring partners, opening experts, so they share a lot of knowledge with each other, and that's always a special game. Well, let's see what happens in this game. I will take you through the ins and outs. Fabi goes for 1e4, and after e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, we have the Italian game, d3, h6, preventing white from getting the bishop out to g5 if white wants to do that. White goes for the move a3. Subtle pawn moves. The reason here you go a3 is that if the bishop comes on the threat, you can always drop back to a2. There's a lot of subtle pawn play, subtle maneuvering in this opening. Let's go through this stage of the game. Bishop c5, knight c3, a6, bishop e3. Another interesting moment, what to do with the bishop. I've talked about it before in other videos. If you do take on e3, white is happy to recapture towards the center, having a half-open f-file that will offer white some attacking chances. However, black played here the move d6, defending the bishop, but white takes it. Bishop takes, pawn takes, black is having double pawns, but does get a nice grip on the d4 square and has a half-open file to work with. Castle kingside, queen d6, and white goes knight d5. What is white contemplating here? Why does he want to exchange knights? Here the question is, what is black going to do? Is black going to take himself, or is just going to castle kingside, which has been played in previous games? Oparin decides here to take on d5. And white can decide here also how to recapture. You would expect maybe to take with the bishop, as it keeps the diagonal for the bishop open, but pawn takes d5 played, attacking the knight. Knight goes away, and look at this, queen e1. Interesting idea. Idea is that if black is going to take on d5, let's say it happens, you take with the queen, queen takes, knight takes, and white is just more active. It's not much, but definitely white is a bit better. Better bishop, more piece activity. You can go f4, f5. There's quite a bit of pressure here, as white's pieces are just superior to black. So black, rather than taking on d5, prepares the capture by playing the move f6. And here it looks like the pawn on d5 is in trouble. How are you going to deal with that? Well, white played knight d2. The knight really wants to come to e4. That's an interesting plan. Black could have taken now the pawn on d5 with his knight, which was not played. And I assume that black didn't like the prospects of facing the move f4, which really does open up the position here. And that's the reason why you played queen e1 and the rook keeping on the f-file. You cannot take with a knight on f4. As rook takes f4, exploiting the pawn being pinned. So here, there's definitely some play. The knight will come in, maybe the queen will come over to g3, rook a e1. I definitely prefer white. So black is not interested in taking the pawn yet. Played bishop f5, so that after knight e4, you can take with the bishop, and white takes back with a pawn. So white's pawn structure has been improved now. Pawn on d5 is protected. All these 16 pawns are still on the board, so it's quite a close position. And normally you would think this knight should be better in close positions than the bishop. And true, the bishop cannot do much. But imagine that pawn on d5 will be gone. Then potentially this bishop can take away a lot of squares and perhaps even infiltrate. So we get to see a very complex technical middle game. Castling kingside played, and white, understandably, is looking for ways to open up the position. Now the pawn break with f4 is not going to work. The queen on d6 and the pawn on e5 are controlling that square. So white is playing at the moment on the other side of the board. b4, adding pressure to the pawn on c5. b6 was played. Pawn takes c5, queen takes c5, and now the move, queen b4. Offering the exchange of queens. And if you do take, you can take back with the pawn. White's going to move the bishop and later on play c4, c5. When you get pawns on b4, c5 and d5, things are looking very, very nice. So black therefore played here the move queen d6, saying that, okay, we can go for the exchange of queens. White did so, takes on d6, but here it's rook f b1, attacking the pawn on b6. Now, a logical response would be b5, attacking the bishop, but bishop goes away. Next move will be a4. It is clear that white is going to exert pressure against pawns on the queen side and possibly even when the b file will be opened against the pawn on b6. So instead, rather than advancing the pawn, Oparin played here the move knight c8. Now, you keep your queen side intact, but you're paying a very high price for it because knight on c8 is stuck, needs to keep the pawn on b6 defended. Bishop goes back to e2. Classy move. Because here you see that the bishop is looking for a way to infiltrate, probably coming into e6 with check. But at the right moment you can eliminate a knight and then take on b6. I mean, you got to reckon that, black can possibly take on c2 and you can take on d6. Even in rook endgames with a pawn down, sometimes black is happy to get such a scenario just to become active. But it's clear that white is pressing here. Black therefore played a move f5. And still it's quite interesting to analyze this position, as I basically expected here the move pawn takes f5. As after rook takes f5 you really want to go for something like bishop g4. Maybe you can start with g3 so that the rook cannot become active, and then you prepare this move bishop g4. White is clearly better. But white played f3, and now it's going to take more time for the bishop to become active. Your structure is nicely intact, but it's going to require some additional performance from white to break through. Rook a7, trying to activate the rook along the 7th rank. Rook b3. So here you see that white is contemplating the plan of coming in with the rook to c6, targeting both pawns. This rook on a7 got to keep. The pawn on a6 defended as well. Pawn takes e4 played. In a way, I was actually thinking maybe it's better to keep the position as close as possible with a move like f4. But let me show you the following line. If you go rook c3 and black is stuck, but white can improve his position with the following moves. And I think it's very instructive to go through the next move. This was all not played, but it really gives you an idea how problematic black's position is. You can go for the move c4, breaking open the queen side. If you do take with the pawn as bishop takes c4 and pawn on a6 is weak, you can go rook a b1. Controlling both the open files, white is making a lot of progress. So basically that is white's plan, to get a rook to c6 and then play a4, a5 and then c4, c5. Anyway, pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, rook c7 played. And this is interesting moment because white can actually take the pawn on a6. But why did Fabi not do that? Well, black can take on c2 and all of a sudden there is this potential counterplay with the rook, the second rook coming to the 2nd rank. And then you have these ideas to wrap up these pawns. Apparently after rook f1, white prevents it and has still the idea to take on c8 followed by rook takes b6. So the rook endgame still looks very promising for white. But understandably, you don't want to calculate all these simplifications. White played the move c4. So that pawn looks nice, but okay, now the pawn on a6 is no longer under attack. g6 was played. White goes a4, intending to go a5. Black blocks it with a5. How should white break through? It's much harder now to break through on the queen side. Maybe you can offer the exchange of rooks and try to bring your king over to the center. Now the rook is cutting off the king, preventing the king from reaching that part of the board. Rook c1 played, h5. So now white no longer has time to go bishop g4. And the reason the rook is on c1 is to overprotect the pawn on c4. White goes g3, king g7. And I was thinking about this plan of activating the bishop once again. But if you do that, bishop f1 will be met by g5 and bishop h3 can be met by g4. And the bishop doesn't reach its favorite diagonal. White played therefore first h4. Rook f7. And white can still consider this maneuver. Bishop f1, rook c5, bishop h3. But then the other rook comes to c7 and there is counterplay against the pawn on c4. Because white is missing the bishop to defend it. Things are not clear at all. White has to be patient. Played king g2. Useful waiting move. Rook f6. Black is going to make waiting moves as well. And white, okay, both players getting lower on time. They're about to reach the time control. They go back and forth. There's no clear plan. But eventually, there's this move, rook f3. Rook takes rook, king takes. And okay, one pair of rooks has been exchanged. But still, black seems to have everything under control. However, and this is very, very difficult because it looks like black is doing a good job. But apparently the best move here was not played. It's the move b5. How insane is that move? If you take with the c pawn, you can activate a rook with check and then put your knight on b6. The extra pawn is completely worthless. Even if you take with the a pawn, you have beautiful pawns on the b and c file. But black is going to protect the pawn from behind. And after king e3, you go knight b6. And once again, the knight is a fantastic blockader when the bishop is simply unable to contest the knight. If this would have been a dark squared bishop, well, then you can challenge the next squares. But here, the knight is doing fantastic. And even after a move like rook c1 to prepare c5, you can go knight e7 and place your knight on c5. Looks like this is going to be a fortress. Missed opportunity. Instead, knight e7 was played. Rook b1, attacking the pawn on b6. Rook b7, king e3, knight g8. And white, before black gets the chance to go knight f6, knight d7, knight c5, white plays here the move g4, adding pressure to the pawn on h5. Pawn takes g4, bishop takes g4, knight f6, and the bishop comes into e6, guys. Bishop is looking good. Now knight e7 can just be met by bishop takes, and then the pawn on b6 is going to fall. And this is still super complicated because by opening up the g file, white has additional plans now to go for something like rook g1, bishop f5. You can hit the pawn on g6. Black played rook b8. Maybe not the best move. It's difficult to say what should have been played. Maybe the knight could have gone back to e8 with the idea to go knight c7, knight a6, knight c5. It's a long way to go for the knight, but well, if you get there, then the knight is much better placed. But in the meantime, as I said, you got to reckon with play on the other side of the board as well. Let's have a look. Rook b8 played, and now, key moment in the game, move 41. White is sacrificing a pawn himself. c5. You can't take with the b pawn. Rook will be hanging. You got to take with the d pawn. But now, white has a passed pawn, which can count on the support of the bishop and probably also on the rook. And it's very difficult to challenge that pawn. I mean, if you go rook d8, it's rook takes b6 and the pawn is defended. Probably black can make a waiting move like king f8. And also for white, it's not simple to make progress here. Because even if you go rook f1, you can go back with the king to g7. And now the rook is no longer on the b file. Black has the plan of wrapping up the d pawn. So that's not going to be a challenge. Even if you go king d3, with the aim of trying to walk in, things are not simple. Black can even make another waiting move, because if the king leaves the protection of the pawn, black is going to take it on e4. Probably this is still a draw. But in the game, black instead played here the move rook h8. He didn't want to play passively, attacking the pawn on h4. White can take on b6 here. Was not played, and I think that after rook takes h4, rook b7, even if you go king f8, it's rook f7, you're picking up the knight. If you go king h6, it feels like there's counterplay. Your pawn on e4 is hanging right now. But apparently, bishop d5 would have been a fantastic move, probably decisive move, because how are you going to stop this pawn? And taking the pawn on d5, well, it's not really gonna help. You can just recapture in that case. So well, that's quite a tough line, has to be said. But anyway, instead of taking the pawn on b6, white pushes his main asset. Very understandable. Then you also cannot take on h4 because white is queening the d pawn. Rook goes to d8. I was actually wondering why not go to b8 to keep your pawn defended. Well, that is a tricky line. I mean, even if you take on b6, there is this remarkable move knight takes d7 when you're defending the rook. If you take it, you take back with a knight. If you take the knight, then the rook can be taken actually. So rook b8, perhaps a better attempt after rook g1, followed by bishop f5. There's still a lot of problems. Even if you go away with the king, rook will come into g5 with the idea to take the pawn. White is getting closer and closer to victory. Therefore, after d7, rook d8 played. Rook takes b6. Now, if you take that pawn, it's rook b7, and the knight is pinned and gone. Black played king f8. And now, fantastic move, bishop c4. The bishop is going back, blocking the pawn, and the rook is attacking the knight. Again, if you take on d7, is rook takes g6 with white regaining the material, but also intending to swap rooks, after which the endgame should probably technically winning with an outside passed pawn. After king g7, bishop b5 played. The pawn is of course poisoned because it runs into rook d6. King f7, rook c6. Again, very nice idea. Even if you take now with the rook, it is rook takes f6. Rook, king takes, bishop takes, rook. You cannot take with the rook on d7, and white has simple plan of eliminating all these weak pawns. Knight takes pawn was played, bishop c4. King e7, rook e6. Very, very nice move, because where is the king going? In the game, king f7 was played, but I want to show you this line. If you go king f8, you can take on g6. We have actually seen already this position, but why is this so good? Well, for instance, if you go with your king to e7, there is rook e6 again, king f8. Now you can put a bishop on b5. And, well, that knight is in huge trouble. I mean, if the knight moves, the pawns are going to be taken. If king goes, for instance, here, you put a rook on d6. And this position, it's very important for the understanding, is that after king e7, everything is defended, but white can swap everything on d7. And then the king and pawn endgame is winning, because you cannot ignore that h-pawn as black. The king got to go in this direction, and white is going to pick up all the remaining pawns with a technical win. So that's why the endgame is so good for white. I mean, white in the game had to deal with the move king f7. You're looking for a nice discovered check. Well, do it. Rook takes e5, bishop gives check. King f8, rook goes back to e6. And now also the pawn on g6 is in trouble. If you go king g7, you go rook d6, followed by bishop b5, and the king and pawn endgame should be winning once again. There followed rook b8, looking for possible counterplay. You prevent it. Bishop b5, closing the b file, attacking the knight. Knight is a really bad piece in this position. Rook b7 played. Rook takes g6. That's actually now it's white who's a pawn up. You see that white started with a nice pawn sacrifice. Now he's a pawn up. He's getting back all the pawns with interest. And still these pawns are weak. White has passed pawns himself. Knight went to e5. And here rook g5, and the knight is in trouble. Wherever the knight goes, the pawn on c5 is going to hang. Let's say knight f7, rook takes c5. You're 2 pawns up, and no hope of surviving this. Instead, rook e7 may have been considered, but instead, black resigned after rook g5. Because after rook e7, you can go king f4, and you're hitting the knight. And once again, the knight really cannot go anywhere. Look at this bishop. It's now on 2 squares distance, dominating the knight. So it means there's no good check. Even if the knight goes to d7, you can trade off the bishop for the knight. And after rook takes d7, rook takes c5, you're 2 pawns up. Maybe you're even winning a third one. This endgame is completely lost. So after rook g5, Fabi is winning his 4th game in a row. I mean, should be said once again that his previous game against Christopher Yu doesn't count for the standings. But regarding self-confidence, this is another big victory for Fabi, who is now gaining a lot of rating points from the games played at the US Championships. And he's clear number 2 in the world right now. So that's very, very impressive play. I really like this game. I think maybe Fabi even made a few inaccurate decisions along the way. But in general, very high-class performance. And this game really nicely shows the difference in quality between bishop and knight, especially in these endgames. The bishop was just a monster and the knight didn't have a nice active spot, no outpost. And then you see that the knight was really swimming in its own camp, trying to find a nice square to go to. But, well, with a lack of space, it's very difficult to activate the knight. I like this game. I hope you liked it as well. If you like this video, then you know what to do, of course. Let me grow the channel with your support, guys. I really need it. So hit the subscribe button. You can make a PayPal donation. You can like this video. Do what you feel is good for the channel. Thanks for all the support.